There are talks about a new world reserve currency appearing in the near future. The dollar has always occupied a specific place among reserve currencies. It is the one most countries can't do without. If any country decides not to keep enough dollars on their accounts, then they might find it difficult to pay other countries in exchange for imports. Their own local currencies might require the dollar to function as a peg of sorts to make sure the value of their local currency remains afloat. Fail to keep enough of the US dollar in their reserves and the country might meet a crisis like Sri Lanka's, unable to pay for basic necessities because they lack enough dollars to do so. No one wants Sri Lankan rupees, but everyone wants the American dollar. Trading between countries have always been common, but after the Bretton Woods Agreement and various shenanigans, the US dollar became the world reserve currency. The almighty dollar's role as the primary currency used to buy oil also cemented its place in the New World Order. As a result, the currency used by countries to pay for those goods from other countries in the last century has been dominated by the US dollar. Having your currency become the world reserve currency provides a lot of benefits. Not only can the American government borrow money by issuing bonds at a lower interest rate, there is almost a guarantee that there will be a ton of buyers who want bonds because of the guarantee and safety it holds. This is why the US has over $1 trillion worth of debt without defaulting. It is also why US lawmakers don't really care if the US debt snowballs. US politicians continue to spend the country's money frivolously and keep raising the US budget year over year because they know they can always get away with it by borrowing more money. Becoming the world reserve currency also means dollars are used in over half the world's transactions. So if the US stops transactions of the US dollar for certain countries, they can engineer an economic shutdown of said country. The US is no stranger to issuing sanctions to countries it doesn't like to further US interest. Without its status as the world reserve currency, US sanctions wouldn't be as effective as they are today. Knowing the many benefits controlling the world reserve currency provides, it is unsurprising that many countries want their own currency to achieve the coveted world reserve currency status. So who are these people who want to upend the balance of power of the world? Well, the BRICS nations are a group of the largest emerging economies which came together to form a collective of sorts in the 2000s. Their initial aim was to foster cooperation between member nations in the name of common economic prosperity. Near the end of June 2022, the BRICS nations convened at their 14th BRICS Summit. There, Vladimir Putin, Russia's president, announced the BRIC nations, mainly Russia, India, China, South Africa, and Brazil, planned on issuing a new global reserve currency. At the same time, the BRIC Summit leader also invited countries like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey to join them to create a brand new international reserve currency. This new reserve currency proposed by the BRICS countries challenges the current status quo dominated by the US dollar. It's an open challenge to the American government. People were stunned by the revelation. That begs the question, why do these countries want to make a new reserve currency? In Russia's case, it's simple. America has been their longest lasting enemy for decades. The Cold War never ended. The war zone only changed from battlefields to economic minefields. Russia doesn't want to use the currency of an enemy country. It's forced to do so because of the US dollar hegemony. The US and other Western civilizations have imposed sanctions crippling Russia's economy in response to Russia's war on Ukraine. The US Treasury has halted Russia's access to its dollars. The US has also stopped Russia from using SWIFT payments, which is the primary tool which allows people to move money across the world. This disconnected Russia from the international financial markets. Any Russian company will find it hard to operate internationally without SWIFT payment services. The US did this to stop Russia from using the money for their war in Ukraine. Russia's central bank had over $630 billion in its foreign currency reserves, but with one swift US intervention, Russia lost access to half of that. Over $300 billion owned by Russia but stashed in foreign banks were immediately inaccessible. The reasoning used was America wanted to destroy Russia's economy, so the Russians had no money to spend on the war. If China didn't allow Russia to access its international reserves in the yuan, Russia's economy would be in a worse state than it is now. Russia is in the wrong for starting a war with Ukraine, but the way the US was able to freeze Russia's access to its assets shows a fatal flaw in having only one central world reserve currency. There are other types of reserve currencies present in the market. However, the dollar is the de facto world reserve currency that everyone uses. Russia is more keen than ever to find a way to remove the US from their seat of power. One way Russians intend to achieve this is by ousting the dollar and replacing it with a new world reserve currency. China, on the other hand, has a love-hate relationship with the US. Its economy relies on orders from US companies, and its country's revenues relies on factories churning out goods at an affordable price for Western powers. China's largest importer is the US, showing China's economic health is closely tied to America. China has been biding its time for years, keeping its head down and toiling away so it could reach greater heights. Now China is great again. It wants to be first place. China is dubbed the world's factory, and it is the second largest economy on earth. Ever since China regained power, it's begun throwing its weight around, agitating its neighbors and picking fights with America. Without America, China wouldn't be where it is today. There are reasons why China hates that one country that helped it become one of the largest world powers. It feels underappreciated because while it maintains its status as the world's largest trading partner, its currency only makes up less than 2% of the world's reserves. China resents how much control America has over its own economy. For years now, China has been on the receiving end of US tariffs, a product of President Trump's trade war, which continues to dampen their economic might to this day. A day never goes by where the US criticizes China's human rights violations and intellectual property theft. And for good reason too. A lot of the criticism is valid, but China's leadership think otherwise. They see America as a hostile force they need to cooperate with to reap economic benefits. China is also wary of the SWIFT system, the same SWIFT system which powers most of cross-border payments between countries. The problem with SWIFT payments for China is that the money transferred through the SWIFT system will either be settled ultimately in dollars or involves at least one US financial institution before they reach their destination. One nicely timed US sanction would be enough to deny China's access to US payment networks and clearing infrastructure. This would cripple China's link to the world economy swiftly. America uses its sanctions regularly to promote its foreign policy abroad. America did this to punish Russia, so why wouldn't it do the same thing to China? Which is why when China saw how much devastation US sanctions wrought on Russia's economy, China's ambition sped up and it was incentivized to cooperate with Russia in a bid to create the new world reserve currency. Russia has already started using alternative currencies as part of its foreign reserves. After the Ukrainian war began, China's currency, the yuan, became the third most sought after foreign currency in Russia after the US dollar and euro. But there's always the fear that China would devalue its currency when the time comes and it suits interest. China, on the other hand, is planning to disrupt the US dollar's world reserve position in a different way: yuan pools. So what is a yuan pool? The yuan refers to China's currency, while the pool refers to a reserve liquidity pool. The way this works is China, along with a few other countries, 5 of them, mainly Indonesia, Malaysia, Hong Kong, Chile, and Singapore, will each contribute a minimum of $2.2 billion into a pool of money, which will be deposited in the bank for international settlements. Countries which have contributed to this pool of money will be allowed to access it if they suffer from liquidity problems in times of volatility. In addition, countries would also gain access to additional funding by using the money held in the yuan money pool as collateral if they need it. This renminbi liquidity arrangement, as China calls it, is aimed at raising international demand for the yuan. It's basically China's way of making more people use their currency. By giving them a convenient way to borrow money, China is open to more members joining its yuan pool in the future. This isn't the only thing China has done to challenge the US dollar. China has also signed many bilateral currency swap agreements with more than 40 countries, including Europe, England, South Korea, Singapore, and Russia. Those deals are worth over 3 trillion yuan, so roughly $430 billion. China is actively trying to encourage the use of its currency. It's tried using its yuan in trade settlements. Despite this, the dollar hegemony is still too strong. The American dollar still outpaces the yuan as more dollars are used for global payments, forex transactions, and reserve assets. To put things into perspective, the US dollar accounts for over 40% of global payments, while China only powers a measly 2% of global payments. In terms of global foreign reserves of various countries, the dollar accounts for 59% of the reserves, while the euro powers 20% of the reserves. China, on the other hand, only accounts for 2.8% of those reserves. China has other horses in the race. The country introduced its own digital currency, the digital yuan, back in 2020. It advertised its digital yuan heavily by allowing visitors of Beijing's 2022 Winter Olympics to pay for goods and services using the digital yuan. It's been a long time coming since China began its foray into digital currencies way back in 2014. The goal of the digital yuan is to create a new form of money which China hopes will one day replace the dollar. The digital yuan, unlike other payment apps, does not need an internet connection. Just pressing 2 phones together will suffice for the transaction direction. If China's goal is global adoption of its digital yuan, there are many ways China could promote it. They could use it in their cross-border payments in their Belt and Road projects, or issue their loans to Africa through the digital yuan. Trust is the key issue with China's digital yuan. People aren't willing to trust a currency which can be shut down by a government on a whim. We've seen sci-fi shows where the money just drops to zero with a click of a button. There's no indication that China can or will shut down its digital yuan based on circumstances. However, based on their track records, authoritarian shenanigans, there is a risk of China shutting down the digital wallet ecosystem of someone or any country they deem to be a threat. There are many roadblocks stopping China's currency from becoming a new world reserve currency. Its financial markets aren't transparent and their monetary policies are unstable. The yuan is not as freely traded on the forex exchange markets compared to other currencies. This is because in order for the yuan to be freely traded on forex markets, China has to relax its yuan currency peg against the dollar, something it's been reluctant to do for years. Currency manipulation has been the backbone of China's economic strategy to keep their goods cheap and exports high. By keeping the yuan weaker than the US dollar, it encourages US companies to manufacture their products in China, shoring up China's economy. US lawmakers have complained about the yuan peg for years, but China doesn't seem intent on stopping its devaluation of the yen. The economic benefits for China are just too high and too great to ignore. China's currency, the yuan, only became part of the reserve currency of the world in 2015, and the IMF added the yuan to its special drawing basket in 2016. China's foray into the reserve currency game is relatively recent. More time will be necessary for China to overtake the US dollar, if they ever do overtake it. Now that we know that China, Russia, as well as a host of other countries like the BRIC nations are trying to get into the world reserve currency bandwagon, what's America doing in response to this situation? Well, US President Joe Biden in March of 2022 signed an executive order urging his government to assess the benefits and risks of crypto and to explore the possibility of making a digital dollar. Now, I should make it clear that the American president isn't trying to make a digital dollar. He's just urging people to do more research on whether it is possible to launch a digital dollar. The Federal Reserve is way ahead of Joe Biden and began their research on the possibility of the digital dollar a year ago. They've issued a report on the benefits and risks of a digital dollar, but didn't advise on whether the US should make its own digital currency. Currently, the US dollar's position as a world reserve currency is still stable. The threats of a new world reserve currency from the BRIC nations are minuscule. It's going to take more than that to dethrone the US dollar. Like and subscribe.